Sometimes the quietest man in town carries the greatest story. Sometimes respect runs deeper than anyone can see. In Dusty Creek, Elias sweeps the saloon porch for spare change. But when wild mustangs stampede down Main Street, something impossible happens. While everyone runs for cover, Elias walks straight into the path of thundering hooves. He doesn't draw a weapon. He simply stands there, arms wide, as the lead stallion charges toward him. Then the impossible, the massive horse stops inches from his chest. The entire herd follows. What the town discovers is their janitor is the legendary horse king who vanished years ago. How does a man everyone dismissed still command the respect of wild animals? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun rose over Dusty Creek, the way it always did, slow and deliberate, painting the wooden storefronts in shades of amber and rust. The town sat in a shallow valley between the Medicine Bow Mountains and the endless grasslands that stretched east toward the horizon. It was 1889, and Dusty Creek had seen better days. The silver mine that birthed the town still coughed up ore, but not like it used to. Buildings leaned slightly, as if tired from standing upright for so long. Paint peeled, boardwalks creaked, but life continued with the steady rhythm of a place that had learned to endure. Elias Crane stood on the porch of the Silver Spur Saloon, broom in hand, as he did every morning before the town stirred. The broom was old, its handle worn smooth by 2 decades of use, the bristles splayed and uneven. He swept with careful strokes, creating neat piles of dust and debris that he'd gather into a pan and carry to the burn barrel behind the building. The work was simple, honest, and it suited him fine. He was 67 years old, though his stooped posture made him seem older. His hair had gone completely silver, hanging past his collar in a way that was more neglect than style. Deep lines carved paths across his weathered face, each one a map of years lived hard and quiet. His hands were large and scarred, the knuckles swollen from old breaks that had healed without proper setting. He wore canvas pants, a faded blue work shirt, and boots so worn the leather had molded perfectly to his feet. Everything about Elias Crane spoke of a man who had become invisible through sheer ordinariness. The saloon door creaked open behind him. Sarah Winters emerged, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with auburn hair streaked with grey and eyes that missed nothing. She'd owned the Silver Spur for 12 years, ever since her husband died in a mine collapse. "Morning, Elias," she said, her voice warm. "Left you some biscuits on the bar." "Appreciate it, Sarah." His voice was low and rough, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. "You're up earlier than usual." "Couldn't sleep." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Sarah had learned long ago not to pry. Elias was a private man, and whatever ghosts haunted his sleep were his own business. "Well, don't work yourself too hard. It's going to be hot today." "Yes, ma'am." She went back inside, and Elias continued sweeping. Down the street, he could hear the town beginning to wake. The blacksmith's forge clanged to life. Chickens clucked in someone's yard. A dog barked twice, then fell silent. The stage station across the street rattled as the hostler prepared the morning coach. Elias had lived in Dusty Creek for nearly 20 years. He'd arrived one autumn evening with nothing but the clothes on his back and a story so thin it barely held together. He'd been a drifter, he'd said, looking for work. The previous saloon owner had needed someone to sweep and haul and do odd jobs, and Elias had proven reliable. He showed up every day. He worked hard. He kept to himself. Over time, people stopped wondering about him and simply accepted his presence the way they accepted the mountains or the wind. He finished sweeping the porch and carried the debris to the burn barrel. His room was above the town stable, a narrow space with a bed, a chair, a washstand, and little else. The stable owner, a gap-toothed man named Clement, let him stay there in exchange for mucking stalls on Sundays. It was an arrangement that suited both men. Elias climbed the external stairs to his room and set the broom in its corner by the door. The morning light filtered through a single small window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. He poured water from a pitcher into a basin and washed his face and hands, the cold water sharp against his skin. He caught his reflection in a small, cracked mirror above the washstand and paused. The face looking back was a stranger's face in some ways. The boy he'd been, the young man full of dreams and wildness, was buried somewhere beneath all those lines and scars. He touched the scar on his left palm, a thin white line that ran from the base of his thumb to his wrist. It had been there so long he barely noticed it anymore, except on mornings like this, when sleep had been elusive and memories crowded close. He turned away from the mirror and sat on the edge of his bed. Around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt, hung a thin leather cord. Strung on it was a small piece of turquoise, no bigger than his thumbnail, wrapped in worn brass wire. He pulled it out and held it in his palm, feeling its weight. It was the only thing he'd kept from his old life. The only thing that mattered. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He tucked the turquoise back beneath his shirt and stood. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Mayor Thomas Grady, a stout man in his 60s with a grey beard and shrewd eyes. He wore a waistcoat despite the early hour and carried a walking stick, more for show than necessity. "Elias, got a moment?" "Of course, Mayor." Grady stepped inside, glancing around the sparse room. "I need someone to help clear out the old Hendricks place. Family's finally selling, but the barn's full of junk that needs hauling. Thought you might be interested. Pays $2 for the day." "I can do that." "Good man." Grady pulled $2 from his pocket and pressed them into Elias's palm. "Start tomorrow morning. Hendricks' boy will meet you there at sunrise." "I'll be there." Grady hesitated, studying Elias's face. "You've been with us a long time, haven't you?" "Near 20 years. Never caused a lick of trouble. Always do good work." The mayor nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "Town's lucky to have you, Elias." "Just doing what needs doing, Mayor." After Grady left, Elias pocketed the coins and returned to his morning routine. He walked to the pump behind the general store and filled a bucket, then carried it to the saloon for Sarah. He checked the oil lamps along the boardwalk, refilling those that were low. He helped Clement fork hay into the stable stalls. Small tasks, unremarkable tasks, but they filled the hours and kept his hands busy. By mid-morning the sun was high and hot. Elias sought shade under the awning of the general store, watching the town move around him. A wagon rattled past, loaded with timber from the sawmill. Two women in bonnets walked arm in arm, deep in conversation. Deputy Jack Morrison emerged from the sheriff's office, young and confident, his badge catching the light. Morrison spotted Elias and walked over. He was 32, ambitious, and made no secret of his desire to be sheriff when old Sheriff Brennan retired. He had dark hair, a carefully trimmed mustache, and the kind of swagger that came from never having been truly tested. "Elias," he said, nodding curtly. "Deputy, you seen any trouble this morning? Any drifters coming through?" "No, sir." Morrison's eyes narrowed slightly. He'd never quite warmed to Elias, though he couldn't say exactly why. There was something about the old man that didn't sit right, something in the way he moved, or the way his eyes seemed to see more than they should. But Morrison kept his suspicions to himself. Elias had never done anything wrong. "Well, you let me know if you do. We've had reports of horse thieves working the territory. Can't be too careful." "I'll keep watch." Morrison nodded and walked on, boots clomping against the boardwalk. Elias watched him go, then turned his attention back to the street. Horse thieves. The words stirred something old and dark in Elias's chest. He'd known horse thieves once, bad men who saw animals as nothing more than property to be stolen and sold. Men who didn't understand that horses had spirits, memories, loyalties that ran deeper than rope or bridle. Men who had learned eventually that taking what wasn't theirs came with a price. But that was another life, another man. The rest of the day passed in familiar patterns. Elias swept the saloon again in the afternoon. He chopped wood for Mrs. Henderson, a widow who couldn't manage an axe anymore. He fixed a broken gate hinge for the schoolteacher. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, he walked to the edge of town, as he did most evenings. There was a spot just beyond the last house, where the grassland opened up wide and empty. Elias stood there, hands in his pockets, watching the light change. The plains stretched out endlessly, rolling and golden, dotted with sagebrush and wild grasses that swayed in the evening breeze. Somewhere out there, beyond sight but not beyond knowing, wild horses ran free. He could almost hear them, the thunder of hooves, the whistle of wind through manes, the ancient rhythm of freedom. A sound broke his reverie, distant but distinct, the faint drumming of hooves far off toward the northern ranges. Elias stiffened, his entire body suddenly alert in a way it hadn't been in years. He listened, head cocked, every sense straining. The sound faded, swallowed by distance and wind, but it had been there. He was certain of it. Wild horses, a herd, moving fast. He stood there until full darkness fell, until the first stars pricked the deepening blue of the sky. Then he turned and walked back to town, his shadow long behind him, the old questions stirring in his blood like smoke from a fire that had never quite gone out. The blast came at mid-morning 2 days later. Elias was replacing a broken board on the schoolhouse steps when the ground shook beneath his feet. The sound rolled across the valley like thunder, a deep, concussive boom that rattled windows and sent birds exploding from the trees. He dropped his hammer and turned toward the mine, his heart already knowing what his mind was, just catching up to understand. Dynamite. The miners used it to break through stubborn rock, but they were always careful about timing and placement. This blast had been wrong, too loud, too close to the surface. A moment later, a second explosion followed, then a third, each one building on the chaos of the last. People spilled from buildings, shading their eyes against the sun, looking toward the plume of dust and smoke rising from the mine entrance 1/2 mile north of town. Voices rose in confusion and alarm. Someone shouted about a cave-in, Mrs. Henderson clutched her apron and started to cry. Then Elias heard it, a sound that made his blood turn to ice. Thunder, but not from the sky, from the earth itself, growing louder by the second. He knew that sound better than his own heartbeat. Hooves, hundreds of them, coming fast. "Get inside!" he shouted, his voice carrying with an authority that startled everyone within earshot. "Get off the street, now!" Deputy Morrison emerged from the sheriff's office, one hand on his pistol. "What in the hell?" "Stampede!" Elias's voice cut through the confusion like a knife. "Wild horses, spooked by the blast. They're heading straight for town. Get everyone inside." Morrison's face went pale. He'd heard stories about stampedes, entire herds of panicked animals that could trample anything in their path. Buildings, wagons, people. "Everyone inside," he bellowed. "Off the street! Move!" The thunder grew louder. Elias could feel it now through the soles of his boots, the vibration of hundreds of hooves pounding the earth in blind terror. The herd would be coming down the north road, the most direct path, away from the explosions. They'd funnel straight into Main Street, with nowhere to go but through. People scattered. Mothers grabbed children and ran for doorways. Shopkeepers slammed, shutters closed. Mayor Grady herded a group of miners toward the saloon, his walking stick forgotten in his haste. In less than a minute, the street was empty, except for Elias. He stood in the middle of Main Street, his eyes fixed on the north end of town, where the road curved between two buildings. His heart hammered in his chest, but his breathing was steady. His hands, hanging loose at his sides, did not shake. Inside him, something old and familiar was waking up, something he'd buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it was dead. Sarah Winters appeared in the saloon doorway. "Elias, for God's sake, get inside." He didn't move, didn't speak. His entire focus was on the road, on the sound building like an approaching avalanche. Then they came. The lead horse burst around the corner, a massive bay stallion with a coat like polished mahogany and a wild, rolling eye. Behind him surged the herd, a living wall of horseflesh and terror. Mustangs of every color, bays and chestnuts and grays and paints, running shoulder to shoulder, their hooves churning up dust that rose like smoke. There had to be 50 of them, maybe more, and they were coming straight down Main Street with the mindless momentum of a flash flood. Elias took 3 steps forward, placing himself directly in their path. Behind the windows and doors, people watched in horror. Some covered their eyes. Others pressed their faces to the glass, unable to look away. Deputy Morrison grabbed for his rifle, but Mayor Grady caught his arm. "Don't," the mayor breathed. "You'll just scatter them worse." The stallion saw Elias. Its ears flicked forward, then back. It didn't slow. If anything, it ran harder, driven by instinct and fear and the blind need to escape the explosions that still echoed in its memory. Elias spread his arms wide, not in defense, not in threat, just open, palms forward, the way a man might greet an old friend he hadn't seen in years. His lips moved, though no one could hear the words over the thunder. And then, impossibly, he began to sing. It wasn't a song anyone in Dusty Creek had ever heard. It was old, older than the town, older than the territory, older than the railroads and the fences and the mines. It was a song in a language that sounded like wind through grass, like water over stones, like the earth itself speaking. The melody rose and fell, not loud, but carrying somehow over the chaos, reaching through the panic to touch something deeper. The stallion's ears swiveled forward, locked on Elias. Its stride broke, its head came up, and 50 feet from where Elias stood, the great horse planted its front hooves and skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust, its chest heaving, foam flying from its mouth. The herd behind him tried to stop, colliding into one another in a chaos of whinnying and jostling, but they stopped, every single one of them. They milled and stamped and tossed their heads, but they didn't run, they didn't trample. They stood there in the middle of Main Street, wild and beautiful and utterly impossible. Elias lowered his arms slowly. He took one step toward the stallion, then another. The big horse's nostrils flared, its entire body quivering with adrenaline and confusion, but it didn't bolt. It watched Elias approach with eyes that were still wild, but no longer blind with terror. Elias reached up, moving with the careful slowness of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. His scarred hand touched the stallion's sweat-darkened neck. The horse flinched but held. Elias murmured something, words that couldn't be heard but could be felt, and the stallion's head lowered, just slightly. Then, in a gesture that stopped the breath of everyone watching, the wild stallion pressed its nose against Elias's chest and exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry all its fear out into the dusty air. Elias stroked the horse's neck, his movements gentle, his eyes closed. Around them, the herd began to calm. The stamping and whinnying eased. Several of the mares moved closer, their own fear draining away in the presence of this strange, stooped man who smelled like dust and leather and something ancient they remembered in their bones. For a long moment, no one in Dusty Creek moved. The world had contracted to this one impossible scene, an old janitor and a herd of wild mustangs, standing together in the middle of Main Street as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Then Mayor Grady pushed open the saloon door. The creak of the hinges broke the spell. The stallion's head came up, eyes rolling white. Elias murmured again, his hand still on the horse's neck, and the stallion held. But the tension was back, the wildness hovering just beneath the surface. "Easy now," Elias said, his voice low and steady. "Easy. You're safe now. The danger's past." The stallion snorted, shook its massive head, and took a step backward. Elias let his hand fall away. The horse looked at him for one more long moment, something flickering in its dark eyes, recognition perhaps, or memory, or understanding. Then it wheeled and trotted back toward the herd. The other horses parted for him, and as one, The entire group turned and moved back up Main Street the way they'd come, not running now but walking, their panic spent. They disappeared around the corner, and the sound of their hooves faded into the distance, leaving only dust hanging golden in the morning sun. Elias stood alone in the street, his arms hanging at his sides, his body suddenly heavy with exhaustion. Around him, doors began to open. People emerged slowly, their faces marked with wonder and disbelief, and the beginning of questions they didn't know how to ask. Sarah Winters was the first to reach him. "Elias, how did you—" But she stopped because she'd seen his face. And in that moment, standing in the settling dust with the morning sun behind him, Elias Crane didn't look like the quiet old man who swept her saloon porch. He looked like someone else entirely. Someone they'd never known at all. By noon, everyone in Dusty Creek had heard about what happened. By sundown, the story had already begun to change, growing wilder with each retelling. Some said Elias had tamed the lead stallion with a magic spell. Others claimed the horses had recognized him as their long-lost king. A few insisted it was a miracle, plain and simple, and talked about getting the circuit preacher to come investigate. Elias had retreated to his room above the stable the moment the crowd started gathering. He'd slipped away while people were still emerging from buildings, still talking over one another, still trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Now he sat on his bed, head in his hands, knowing that the careful life he'd built over 20 years was crumbling like old adobe in the rain. A knock came at his door. He didn't answer. The knock came again, more insistent. "Elias, it's Sarah. I brought food." He sighed and opened the door. Sarah stood there with a covered plate and a determined expression. She walked past him without waiting for an invitation and set the plate on his small table. "You need to eat." "I'm not hungry." "I don't care." She crossed her arms and fixed him with a look that had cowed rowdy miners and stubborn drunks for 12 years. "What you did today, that wasn't something a simple janitor could do. So I'm going to sit here until you explain yourself, and you're going to eat while you do it." Elias closed the door and leaned against it. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same qualities that had made him trust her enough to stay in Dusty Creek all these years. Honesty, strength, a heart that had been broken but refused to harden. He moved to the chair and sat down heavily. "You ever hear of the horse people?" he asked quietly. Sarah frowned. "Like in Indian stories." "Not just stories. Real people. My mother was Shoshone. My father was a horse trader from Missouri. I grew up between both worlds, white enough to move through settlements, Indian enough to understand the old ways. The ways with horses." He paused, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Horses aren't just animals. They're spirits with bodies. They remember things, not like we remember, with words and pictures. They remember with feeling, with trust. My mother's people knew this. They knew how to speak with horses, not at them, how to listen, how to become part of the herd rather than trying to control it." Sarah sat on the edge of his bed, listening. "When I was young, I thought I could change things. Make the white men understand that horses weren't property to be broken and mastered. I gathered horses, wild ones, abandoned ones, mistreated ones. Built a herd out on the northern plains. People started calling me the Horse King, though I never cared much for the name." His mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Thought I was building something important. A sanctuary." "What happened?" Elias was quiet for a long moment. "Men with more greed than sense. They wanted the horses to sell. When I refused, they came with guns and torches, scattered the herd, killed some, took others." His voice had gone flat, empty. "I tried to stop them, got shot for my trouble, woke up 3 days later in a Crow village, more dead than alive. The horses I'd protected were gone. The life I'd built was gone. So I walked away from it, and came here, became nobody. Just another old man doing odd jobs for coins." He finally looked up at her. "I thought I could leave it behind. But today," he shook his head, That stallion knew. Somehow he knew, or his bloodline knew. Horses pass down memory in ways we don't understand. That herd has been running these plains for 20 years, and somewhere in them is the echo of the horses I once protected. Sarah absorbed this, her hands folded in her lap. Does anyone else know? No one living. The men who attacked me are long dead or scattered, the Indians who helped me keep their own counsel. I'm just a ghost story now, the horse king who disappeared. Well, Sarah said, standing, you're not a ghost anymore. The whole town saw what you did today. I know. And they're going to have questions. I know that too. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Elias, I'm glad you were here today. Those horses could have killed someone. You saved lives. After she left, Elias sat in the gathering darkness and stared at nothing. He'd spent 20 years trying to be invisible, trying to let the past stay buried where it belonged. But the past had a way of rising up when you least expected it, carried on the thunder of hooves and the dust of a stampede. The next morning he woke to find a crowd gathered outside the stable. When he descended the stairs, they pressed forward, not threatening but eager, their faces bright with curiosity. Mayor Grady stood at the front, his expression more measured. Elias, the mayor said, raising a hand to quiet the murmurs. Folks have been talking about what you did yesterday, about how you knew how to stop those horses. I got lucky, Elias said. That wasn't luck. This came from Deputy Morrison, who'd pushed his way to the front of the crowd. His eyes were sharp, calculating. I've been asking around, sending telegrams, and there's stories from up north 20 years old about a man who lived with wild horses. They called him the Horse King. Description matches you pretty close, Elias. Or should I call you something else? The crowd went silent. Elias felt every eye on him, felt the weight of their expectation and curiosity pressing down like a physical force. He could deny it, lie, but what was the point? They'd seen what they'd seen. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Different life, different man. But you still know horses, Mayor Grady said. Better than anyone I've ever met. I know them. Grady exchanged glances with several others in the crowd, then turned back to Elias. Then we need your help. Those explosions at the mine were caused by carelessness. I've already had words with the foreman, but the wild herds in these parts, they're getting bolder, coming closer to settlements. The ranchers are complaining about them mixing with domestic stock, making the cattle nervous. Some want to start shooting them. No, Elias said, the word coming out harder than he intended. I agree, Grady said, but we need a solution. Those horses are magnificent, but they can't keep running through our streets. If you know how to work with them, how to guide them to better ranges away from town, that would solve a lot of problems. Elias looked at the faces surrounding him. Simple people, mostly. Good people trying to build lives in hard country. They weren't asking him to conquer the horses or break them, just to help keep everyone safe, both human and animal. He thought of the stallion, the way it had stopped, the way it had recognized something in him even after all these years. He thought of the herd disappearing around the corner, free and wild and beautiful. I'll do what I can, he said finally, but I work alone, and we do this my way. Mayor Grady smiled and extended his hand. Fair enough. Elias shook it, feeling the weight of the past settling back onto his shoulders like an old coat he'd thought he'd thrown away for good. Elias left town before dawn the next morning, carrying only a canteen, some jerky, and the leather cord with its turquoise stone visible now outside his shirt. He walked north into the grasslands, following the tracks the herd had left when they'd fled the previous day. The prints were easy to read, 50-some horses moving together, their panic gradually easing as they put distance between themselves and the explosions. He found them near midday, grazing in a wide meadow bordered by cottonwood trees and a meandering creek. The stallion spotted him first, head coming up sharply, ears pricked forward. The mares lifted their heads too, alert but not alarmed. Several of the younger horses moved behind their mothers, but none of them ran. Elias sat down on a flat rock 50 yards from the herd and didn't move. He simply sat, breathing slow and steady, letting his presence become as unremarkable as the rock itself. The horses went back to grazing, though the stallion kept one eye on him. An hour passed, then 2. The sun climbed high and hot. Elias didn't move. This was the first lesson his mother had taught him long ago, when he was barely old enough to walk. Patience. Horses lived in the present moment, and they could sense whether a creature near them was truly calm or just pretending. You couldn't fool them. You had to actually be still, inside and out. By mid-afternoon, a young mare with a white blaze ventured closer. She grazed her way toward him in a zigzag pattern, pretending she wasn't approaching at all. When she was 20 feet away, she lifted her head and stared directly at him, nostrils flaring as she tested his scent on the breeze. Elias remained motionless. The mare took 3 steps closer, then 3 more. Finally, she stretched her neck out as far as it would go and snuffled at his boots. Elias let her investigate. After a moment, satisfied that he posed no threat, she went back to grazing, now only 10 feet away. The stallion had been watching this entire exchange. Now he made his decision. He walked across the meadow with the rolling gait of a king inspecting his domain, approaching Elias head-on. The other horses parted for him, acknowledging his authority. He stopped 5 feet from where Elias sat and pawed the ground once, a challenge and a question combined. Elias stood slowly. He was shorter than the stallion by a good foot and probably outweighed by 400 pounds, but he met the horse's gaze without flinching. Then he did something that would have seemed insane to anyone watching. He turned his back on the wild stallion and walked away. Not running, not hurrying, just walking, calm and steady, back toward the creek. Behind him, he heard the stallion snort. Then the soft thud of hooves following. Elias kept walking until he reached the water's edge. He knelt and cupped his hands, drinking deeply. The stallion came up beside him and lowered its massive head to drink as well, its shoulder nearly touching Elias's arm. They drank together in silence, man and horse, while the rest of the herd watched from the meadow. When Elias stood, the stallion lifted its head too, water dripping from its muzzle. Elias reached out slowly and placed his scarred hand on the horse's neck. The stallion's hide was warm, the muscles beneath rippling with barely contained power, but it didn't shy away. "You remember," Elias murmured, barely above a whisper. "Not you, maybe, but your grandmother did, or your great-grandmother. They ran with my herd, back when the world was different, back when I thought I could protect you all." The stallion turned its head and fixed one dark eye on Elias's face. In that gaze, Elias saw intelligence, wariness, and something else, a kind of acceptance. This strange, 2-legged creature spoke the old language, moved with the old respect. Whatever he was, he belonged to the herd in some way that transcended logic. Elias spent the rest of the afternoon with the horses, not trying to control them or direct them, just being present. He watched their social dynamics, which mares were dominant, which foals were bold, how the stallion maintained order with nothing more than a look or a positioned step. It was all coming back to him, the knowledge he thought he'd lost. It had just been sleeping, waiting. As the sun began to set, he walked back toward town, and wasn't surprised when 6 horses followed him for the first mile before peeling off to return to the herd. The stallion watched him go, standing on a low rise like a sentinel. Sarah was waiting when he got back, sitting on the steps of the stable with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. "Any luck?" she asked. "Some." He sat down beside her, his joints protesting after a day of walking and sitting on hard ground. "They're not as wild as people think, just cautious, smart. They've learned to stay away from men, because men have given them every reason to. Can you move them?" "Not move. Guide. There's better grazing about 10 miles northeast, up in the high meadows, less likely to cross paths with ranches or towns." If I can get the stallion to trust me enough to follow, the herd will come too. How long will that take? Elias shrugged. However long it takes. Can't rush horses. They work on their own time. Sarah smiled. You look different, you know, since yesterday. Younger, somehow. Feel older, he said. But there was no bitterness in it. Just truth. She stood to leave, then paused. Elias, that man you were, the horse king, he did good work. Even if it ended badly, it was still good work. Maybe it's not too late to do it again. After she left, Elias sat alone on the steps and watched the stars emerge. The night air carried the scent of sage and distant wood smoke. Somewhere out in the darkness, the herd was settling down for the night, the stallion standing watch while the others dozed. For 20 years, Elias had tried to be small, invisible, safe. He'd convinced himself that the man he'd been was dead, and good riddance. But sitting there, under the vast Montana sky, he felt something stirring in his chest. Not the young man's wild ambition, something quieter, but no less powerful, a sense of purpose, of unfinished business, of debts that maybe could still be paid. The next morning, he was back in the meadow before the sun rose, and the morning after that, and the day after that. Each time, the horses grew more comfortable with his presence. The mares allowed him to walk among them. The foals grew curious, coming close to sniff his hands and tug at his shirt sleeves with gentle teeth. And the stallion, the magnificent bay with eyes like dark coals, began to follow him. Not far at first, just a few steps when Elias moved from one part of the meadow to another, but it was a beginning, a bridge being built between two worlds, one slow step at a time. Deputy Morrison rode out on the third day and watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. When Elias walked back to town that evening, Morrison was waiting on the road. "That's quite a trick," Morrison said. "Not a trick, just patience. The ranchers are getting nervous. They're talking about bringing in professional hunters to thin the wild herds before next spring." Elias stopped walking. "That would be a mistake." "Maybe. But if you can't move them soon, the town might not have a choice." Morrison turned his horse. "Just thought you should know." Elias watched him ride away, then looked back toward the meadow where the herd grazed in the fading light. Time was running out, and the stakes were higher than just keeping horses off Main Street. This was about survival not just for the herd, but for a way of life that was already disappearing faster than morning frost in summer sun. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by the station master with an apologetic expression. Mayor Grady read it twice, his face growing graver with each word, before walking to the Silver Spur to find Elias. "We have a problem," Grady said, setting the telegram on the bar where Elias was replacing a broken hinge. "That's from the Territorial Livestock Commission. They've had complaints from 3 ranching operations about wild horse interference. They're sending a man named Caleb Drake to assess the situation." Elias picked up the telegram and read it. The words were bureaucratic and cold, but the meaning was clear enough. Drake was a stock inspector with authority to order culling operations if he deemed wild herds to be a threat to commercial interests. "When?" Elias asked. "He'll be here in 5 days. 5 days. Elias set the telegram down carefully, his scarred hands steady despite the anger rising in his chest. "The herd isn't a threat, they're just trying to survive. I know that. You know that. But Drake's job is to protect ranchers' investments, not wild horses." Grady leaned against the bar, looking every one of his 63 years. "If you can move them before he gets here, show that they're not a problem, maybe we can avoid this. Maybe. It's the best chance we've got." After Grady left, Sarah emerged from the back room where she'd been listening. 5 days isn't much time." "No," Elias agreed. "It's not." He spent that day and the next in the meadow, working with the stallion. The trust was growing, but trust wasn't the same as partnership. The stallion would approach him now, would tolerate his touch, would even follow him short distances, But getting the big horse to lead the entire herd on a 10-mile journey through unfamiliar country, that was something else entirely. On the third day, Elias tried something different. He brought a length of rope with him, soft cotton worn smooth from years of use. He'd carried it in his saddlebag decades ago, back when he still believed he could change the world. Now he held it loosely, approaching the stallion in the early morning light. The horse saw the rope and tensed. Elias stopped, letting the rope dangle from his hand, making no move to use it. He stood there for an hour, maybe more, until the stallion's curiosity overcame its wariness. The big horse approached, stretched out its neck, and sniffed the rope carefully. Elias let him investigate. Then, moving with infinite slowness, he brought the rope up and looped it loosely around the stallion's neck. Not tight, not restraining, just resting there like a necklace. The stallion's muscles bunched, its eyes rolled. But it didn't bolt. "Good," Elias murmured. "Good boy. It's not a cage, just a connection. Just a way for us to understand each other." He kept the rope there for 5 minutes, then removed it and walked away. The stallion shook its head hard, as if trying to dislodge the memory of the rope's weight, but it didn't run. That afternoon, Elias did it again, and again the next morning. Each time the stallion's tolerance grew, but time was running out. On the 4th day, Deputy Morrison showed up at the meadow with a rider. Elias didn't recognize a lean man in his 40s with cold grey eyes and a rifle scabbard on his saddle. Morrison made introductions from horseback. "Elias, this is Caleb Drake." He got in a day early. Drake dismounted and walked toward Elias with the confident stride of a man who'd spent his life around livestock and had no patience for sentiment. He studied the herd, counting heads, assessing their condition. "Fine-looking animals," Drake said. "Shame they're in the wrong place." "They're not hurting anyone," Elias said. "Not yet, but they cross onto grazing land. They compete with commercial stock. They attract predators. They carry diseases." Drake pulled out a small notebook and pencil. "How many head?" 53. "You counted?" "I know each one." Drake's eyebrow rose slightly. "That's quite a claim. These are wild animals, not pets." "They're not pets," Elias agreed, "but they're not problems either. I'm moving them to better range, away from settlements and ranches. Just need a few more days." "I don't have a few more days. The commission sent me to make an assessment, and I need to file my report before the weekend." Drake looked at the herd again, his expression unreadable. "Tell you what, you move these horses by tomorrow sundown, not just promise to move them, actually get them to where they're going, and I'll file a favorable report. But if they're still here, or if they've just shifted a few miles down the valley, I'm authorizing a reduction operation." "Reduction operation," Elias repeated flatly. "You mean shooting them?" "I mean managing the population to sustainable levels that don't interfere with commercial interests." Drake's voice was calm, professional, entirely devoid of emotion. "It's not personal. It's just the job." After Drake and Morrison rode away, Elias stood alone in the meadow and felt the old helplessness rising like bile. 20 years ago, he'd faced men like Drake, men who saw horses as numbers on a ledger, problems to be eliminated with bullets and burial pits. He'd fought them then and lost everything. Now here they were again, dressed in the respectable language of livestock management and territorial authority. But he wasn't the same man he'd been 20 years ago. He was older, slower, more careful. But maybe, just maybe, he was also wiser. That evening, he didn't return to town. He built a small fire near the creek and settled in for the night, his bedroll spread on the ground, the stars wheeling overhead. The herd grazed nearby, their dark shapes moving like shadows against the moonlit grass. The stallion stood watch on a low rise, its head high, its presence a steady reassurance to the mares and foals. Elias lay awake long after the fire burned down to embers. He thought about his mother, who'd taught him the songs, about his father, who'd taught him that all living things deserved respect. about the young man he'd been, full of certainty and fire, believing he could single-handedly preserve a way of life that the modern world had already condemned. He thought about the herd he'd built then, and the horses he'd failed to save, about the scars on his body and the deeper scars in his memory, about 20 years of sweeping saloon porches and telling himself it was enough to be invisible, to be safe, to be forgotten. And he thought about the stallion standing sentinel in the darkness, protecting his family the only way he knew how. When dawn came, Elias rose stiff and sore, but with a plan forming in his mind. It was risky. It relied on trust that hadn't fully formed yet, and timing that had to be perfect. But it was the only chance they had. He walked to where the stallion stood and placed his hand on the great horse's neck. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "tomorrow we find out if you really remember, if that blood of yours carries the knowledge of your ancestors, if you trust me enough to take your family to safety." The stallion turned its head and regarded Elias with those dark, intelligent eyes. Then it lowered its head slightly, not submission, but acknowledgement. An answer, perhaps. Or maybe just hope, wearing a different face. Either way, it would have to be enough. Elias spent the morning preparing. He walked the route he intended to take northeast through the grasslands, skirting the edge of a pine forest, then up into the high meadows where water ran clear and grass grew thick, even in late summer. It was 10 miles as the crow flew, but closer to 12 following terrain that horses could navigate safely with foals in tow. He checked for hazards. A washout from spring rains that had carved a 3-foot drop into what used to be a gradual slope. He'd need to go around that. A stretch of ground that looked solid, but he knew from experience turned marshy after the morning dew, dangerous for horses moving at speed. A stand of dead timber where a lightning strike had killed a half-dozen trees, leaving them leaning at angles that could spook nervous animals. He marked the route in his mind the way his mother had taught him, not with maps or compasses, but with landmarks that meant something. The lightning-split boulder, the cottonwood that grew in the shape of an old woman dancing, the place where the wind made a particular sound through a gap in the rocks. These were the signposts that mattered when you traveled with horses who navigated by instinct and feeling rather than human logic. When he returned to the meadow in early afternoon, he found visitors waiting. Sarah had come, along with Mayor Grady and a handful of townspeople who'd grown curious about the strange hermit work happening out in the grasslands. Even Deputy Morrison was there, sitting his horse at a respectful distance. "Thought you might want support," Sarah said simply. "Tomorrow's a big day." Elias appreciated the gesture, but crowds made horses nervous. He asked them to stay back, to be quiet, to watch without interfering. They agreed, settling on a low hill overlooking the meadow like spectators at some ancient ritual. Elias approached the stallion, the soft rope coiled in his hand. The big horse saw him coming and walked to meet him, a change from previous days when Elias had always had to approach first. They met in the center of the meadow, and Elias slipped the rope around the stallion's neck, leaving the ends loose and untied. Then he began to walk, not toward the high meadows that would come tomorrow, just a circle around the meadow, testing whether the stallion would stay with him, stay connected, without force or restraint. The rope was just symbolic now. If the horse wanted to leave, it could simply lower its head, and the rope would slide off. The stallion walked beside him, its stride matching Elias's pace. After one circuit, Elias walked in a different direction. The stallion followed. Then another direction, and another, creating a complex pattern across the grass. The horse never pulled away, never tested the boundaries. It simply stayed close, as if the rope were unnecessary. Behind them, the rest of the herd watched. One of the older mares, a grizzled grey with scars from old cougar attacks, started following. Then another mare joined, and another. Within 10 minutes, the entire herd was moving with them, flowing across the meadow in a loose, organic formation, with the stallion and Elias at its center. On the hillside, the townspeople watched in silence. Sarah found she was holding her breath. Even Morrison seemed impressed, though he kept his expression carefully neutral. Elias brought them to a halt near the creek and removed the rope from the stallion's neck. The big horse shook himself, then lowered his head to drink. The herd spread out around them, grazing, resting, completely at ease. "It's like they're a single creature," Mayor Grady murmured to Sarah. "The way they move together." "They trust him," Sarah replied. "Really trust him. I've never seen anything like it." Morrison, however, was thinking about Caleb Drake and the report that would determine these horses' fate. Trust was beautiful, but could it translate into the kind of coordinated movement needed to drive a herd 12 miles across open country? That was a different matter entirely. As the afternoon wore into evening, most of the townspeople drifted back to Dusty Creek. They had work and families and lives that couldn't be put on hold, even for something as remarkable as what they'd witnessed. But Sarah stayed, and so did Morrison, though for different reasons. Sarah stayed because she'd seen the weight on Elias's shoulders, the quiet desperation beneath his calm exterior. She built a small fire and made coffee, offering it to both men without comment. Morrison stayed because he wanted to see how this ended. He'd sent the telegrams about the Horse King, done the research that had exposed Elias's past. Part of him felt guilty about that, about dragging an old man's history into the light. But another part, the part that had ambitions of being sheriff someday, knew that sometimes you had to make hard choices. If the horses couldn't be moved, if Drake ordered them killed, Morrison would have to be there to enforce it. That was the job. As darkness fell, Elias sat by the fire and spoke quietly, more to himself than to his companions. "My mother used to say that horses remember what humans forget, that they carry wisdom in their blood, passed down from ancestors we can't even imagine. Wild horses that saw the world before fences, before railroads, before any of this." He gestured vaguely at the darkness beyond the firelight. "I used to think that was just poetry. Beautiful words from a beautiful woman." "You don't think that anymore?" Sarah asked. "I don't know what I think, but that stallion, there's something in him that knows me, or knows what I represent. Not me personally, but what I am. A bridge, maybe, between the world that was and the world that is." "That's a heavy burden for one old man," Morrison said, not unkindly. Elias smiled without humor. "Most burdens are heavier than they need to be. We carry them anyway." They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire burn down. The herd was dark shapes in the darkness, barely visible, but Elias could feel them out there. The rhythm of their breathing, the occasional stamp of a hoof, the rustle of movement as a mare shifted position or a foal pressed closer to its mother. "What happens if you can't move them?" Morrison finally asked. The question they'd all been thinking. "Then I fail," Elias said simply. "Again. And they die. Again. And I get to spend whatever years I have left knowing I wasn't good enough, fast enough, strong enough." He poked at the fire with a stick. "But I'm too old and too tired to lie to myself anymore, so I'll try, and we'll see what happens." Sarah reached over and squeezed his shoulder briefly. "You're not alone this time. That has to count for something." "Maybe," Elias said. But his eyes were on the darkness where the stallion stood watch, and his thoughts were already racing ahead to morning, to the moment when everything would be tested, when trust would either hold or shatter like glass under a hammer. He didn't sleep much that night. None of them did. They kept the fire burning low and watched the stars wheel overhead, marking time until the moment when dawn would come, and with it the reckoning they all knew was unavoidable. Tomorrow would reveal whether an old man's connection to wild horses was real enough to overcome fear, distance, and the steady encroachment of a world that had no room left for legends. Dawn broke clear and cold, the kind of morning where the air felt thin as glass and every sound carried for miles. Elias was already awake, had been awake, watching the sky lighten by degrees from black to deep blue to the pale gold of early sunrise. The herd was stirring, the mares rising from where they'd rested, the foals stretching and testing their legs. He was about to approach the stallion when he heard hoofbeats, a single rider coming fast from the direction of town. Elias turned to see Clement, the gap-toothed stable owner, riding hard on a borrowed horse, his face flushed from exertion. "Elias!" Clement pulled up sharply, the horse dancing sideways. "You need to come back to town, now." "I can't. Today's the day I move the herd, or Drake orders them killed." "That's just it." Clement caught his breath, words tumbling out. "There's a woman at the saloon. Rode in last night from Fort Benton. She's looking for you. Says she has information about Caleb Drake. Says he's not what he claims to be." Sarah and Morrison were already on their feet, moving toward Clement. "What do you mean?" "Not what he claims?" Morrison demanded. "She wouldn't tell me. Said she needs to speak to Elias directly. Said it's urgent." Elias looked at the herd, then at the rising sun. Every minute counted. But something in Clement's voice, in the urgency of the message, made him pause. "How far behind you is she?" "She's not behind me. She's waiting in town. She can't ride well, city woman, but she insisted I find you immediately." "Go," Sarah said to Elias. "Morrison and I will stay with the herd. If you're not back in 2 hours, She hesitated. "We'll figure something out." Elias made his decision. He swung up behind Clement on the borrowed horse, and they rode hard for Dusty Creek, leaving the herd grazing peacefully in the meadow, unaware that their fate hung by an even thinner thread than before. The woman was waiting in the Silver Spur, sitting at a corner table with a leather satchel and a cup of coffee gone cold. She was perhaps 50, dressed in a dark traveling suit, with sharp eyes and an air of competence that reminded Elias of a schoolteacher or a clerk. She stood when he entered. "Mr. Crane, or should I say, the Horse King?" "Elias is fine. Who are you?" "Margaret Hayes. I worked for the Territorial Livestock Commission in Helena. I say worked because I resigned yesterday after discovering what I'm about to tell you." She gestured for him to sit. "Caleb Drake is not conducting a standard assessment." "Then what is he doing?" Margaret opened her satchel and pulled out a stack of papers. 6 months ago, a man named Vernon Hutchins purchased grazing rights to 12,000 acres of public land northeast of here. The purchase was legal, properly filed, all the paperwork in order. But there's a provision in the contract that voids the sale if the land is deemed unsuitable for commercial ranching due to, and I quote, "persistent interference from unmanaged wildlife populations." Elias felt something cold settle in his stomach. "The high meadows." "Exactly. The land you're planning to move the horses to. Hutchins wants out of the contract. Turns out the land's not as valuable as he thought, but he'll lose a substantial deposit if he simply backs out. However, if Drake files a report stating that wild horses make the land commercially unviable, Hutchins can void the contract and recover his money. And Drake gets a generous finder's fee according to documents I found in his office. He's not here to assess anything. He's here to ensure those horses become a problem that justifies exactly the outcome Hutchins wants." Margaret's expression was grim. "The reduction operation isn't about managing populations. It's about creating a paper trail that makes this land look worthless." Mayor Grady had entered during Margaret's explanation, followed by several other townspeople drawn by the commotion. "That's fraud," Grady said flatly. "It is. But proving it in court would take months, maybe years, and by then those horses will be dead and Hutchins will have his money back." Margaret looked at Elias. "I rode through the night to warn you because I grew up with horses. My father was a cavalry officer. I know what they mean, what they represent, and I couldn't let this happen without at least trying to stop it." Elias stood abruptly and walked to the window, his mind racing. The high meadows were gone as an option. If he moved the herd there, he'd be playing directly into Drake's hands, giving him exactly the justification he needed to order them killed. But if he didn't move them, Drake would file his report anyway, claiming they were a persistent threat to settlements. "There has to be another place," Mayor Grady said. "Other land far enough from ranches and towns. Not within a day's travel, Elias replied. And I can't keep the herd moving indefinitely. They need stable grazing, water, shelter for winter. They need a home. What about the old Blackwood ranch? This came from an unexpected source, Deputy Morrison, who just arrived from the meadow, having left Sarah to watch the herd. It's been abandoned for 5 years, ever since the owner died without heirs. The territorial government claimed it, but nobody's done anything with it. 40 acres of good grass, a creek, timber for windbreaks. That's only 6 miles from here, Grady objected. Too close to town. Maybe not. Morrison was thinking hard, the lawman in him working through logistics. If we could get the territorial government to designate it as a wildlife preserve, horses included, it would be protected. Drake couldn't touch it. That would take legislation, Margaret said. Months of bureaucratic process. Unless we had the territorial governor's direct authorization, Morrison looked at Elias. Sarah mentioned you once helped some Crow families relocate peacefully during a land dispute 20 years back. Prevented what could have been a violent confrontation. The man who was territorial secretary back then is governor now, James Whitcomb. If he remembers you, if he owes you, he might sign an emergency order, Margaret finished, her eyes lighting up. Designating the Blackwood property as temporary protection for a culturally and historically significant wild herd, pending full legislative review. Whitcomb has that authority in cases involving preservation of territorial heritage. Elias turned from the window. That still leaves today. Even if Whitcomb remembers me, even if he agrees, we can't get a telegram to Helena and back before then. No, Mayor Grady said slowly, but we might be able to stall Drake long enough to buy time. He smiled, and it was not a kind smile. Let me talk to him. I may be an old man, but I've been negotiating with difficult people for 40 years. I think I can keep him occupied until we hear from Helena. Margaret stood. I'll draft the telegram to Governor Whitcomb immediately. If you trust me to speak for you, Mr. Crane, I can explain the situation and invoke your past service. Do it, Elias said. Then, to Morrison, I need to get back to the herd. If this works, I'll need to move them to the Blackwood place before anyone changes their mind. If it doesn't, he didn't finish the sentence. It'll work, Sarah said firmly from the doorway, where she'd just arrived after riding back from the meadow. It has to. Elias looked at these people, the saloon owner, the mayor, the deputy, the clerk who'd risked her career for horses she'd never met, and felt something shift in his chest. 20 years ago, he'd tried to save a herd alone and failed. Now, he wasn't alone. The question was whether that would be enough to change the ending. The telegram went out before noon, addressed directly to Governor James Whitcomb in Helena with Margaret Hayes's signature and the urgent notation that response was needed before sundown. Then came the waiting. The kind of waiting that stretched minutes into hours and made every sound, every footstep, every creak of the telegraph office door seem like it might be the answer they desperately needed. Mayor Grady found Caleb Drake at the hotel restaurant, eating a leisurely lunch. The mayor sat down, uninvited, ordered coffee, and began a long, meandering conversation about territorial politics, mining regulations, and the complex history of land use disputes in Montana. Drake listened politely at first, then with growing impatience, but Grady was a master of the endless meeting, the circular discussion, the question that spawned 3 more questions. He kept Drake talking for 2 hours. Meanwhile, Elias returned to the meadow. The herd was restless, sensing his tension the way horses always could. The stallion approached him immediately, pushing its nose against his chest, huffing warm breath that smelled of grass and wildness. "Not yet," Elias murmured, stroking the great horse's neck. "Soon, maybe, but not yet." He walked the perimeter of the meadow, checking on each horse, noting which foals seemed strong and which were still wobbly on their legs. There was a young colt, no more than 3 months old, with a coat the color of dark chocolate and a white star on its forehead. It kept close to its mother, a dun mare with gentle eyes. If they had to move quickly, that colt would be the one most at risk, too young to keep up with the herd's full pace, but too old to be carried. Sarah had ridden back out with supplies, bread, cheese, water. She found Elias sitting by the creek, his eyes distant. "Margaret's telegram went through," she reported. "Now we wait." "I'm not good at waiting." "Nobody is." She sat beside him, not touching but close enough that her presence was felt. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why horses? Of all the things you could have dedicated your life to, why them?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, watching the water slide over smooth stones. "My father used to say that horses were God's way of showing humans what we could be if we tried harder. Strong but gentle, powerful but willing to serve, independent but capable of loyalty that lasted lifetimes." He picked up a pebble and tossed it into the creek. "My mother said something different. She said, horses remember what we've forgotten, that freedom and family aren't opposites, that you can be wild and still belong to something bigger than yourself." "You believe that?" "I want to. God knows I've tried to live both sides of it, the wild part and the belonging part. Mostly I've just ended up being neither. Not wild enough to run with the horses, not tame enough to fit with people." "You fit here," Sarah said, "in Dusty Creek. You've belonged here for 20 years, whether you realized it or not." "As what? The old man who sweeps your porch?" "As Elias, the man who shows up, who does what he says he'll do, who stands in front of stampeding horses instead of running away." She turned to look at him directly. "That's not nothing. That's not invisible. That's real." Before he could respond, they heard hoofbeats, multiple riders coming fast. Morrison arrived first, followed by Mayor Grady and 2 miners who'd volunteered to help. Grady was out of breath but smiling. "Drake's getting suspicious. I've stalled him as long as I can. But Margaret sent word," the telegraph operator said. "A reply came through from Helena 15 minutes ago. She's bringing it now." They waited in tense silence until Margaret appeared, riding awkwardly on a borrowed horse, waving a yellow telegram paper above her head. She dismounted clumsily and thrust the paper at Elias. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it. The message was brief, written in the terse style of official communications. "Emergency designation approved. Stop Blackwood Ranch property, hereby designated temporary wildlife preserve. Effective immediately. Stop formal documentation to follow. Stop Whitcomb remembers. Crow Creek incident. Stop says debt repaid. Stop." Elias read it twice, then looked up at the faces surrounding him. He approved it. A cheer went up from the small group. Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes bright. Even Morrison cracked a smile, but Elias's mind was already racing ahead to the next problem. "I still have to move them. The Blackwood place, it's 6 miles from here. We need to go now, before Drake figures out what happened and tries to interfere." "He can't," Margaret said. "The order is legal and binding, but you're right, the sooner we establish the herd on protected land, the better." Elias turned to look at the herd. 53 horses, mares, foals, yearlings, and 1 magnificent stallion who'd placed his trust in a bent old man with more scars than sense. 6 miles. It would take hours, and every step would be a test of the fragile connection they'd built. "I'll need help," Elias said. "Not to drive them, that won't work, but to guide them. Keep them together if they scatter. Watch for hazards." "We're here," Morrison said simply, and the others nodded. Elias walked to the stallion and slipped the rope around its neck one more time. The horse stood calm, accepting the touch. Elias leaned close and whispered in a language none of the others understood, the old Shoshone words his mother had taught him, words for trust and journey and home. Then he began to walk. Not toward the Blackwood Ranch yet. First, he needed to gather the herd, bring them together, make sure they understood that something was about to change. The stallion walked beside him, and the mares lifted their heads, watching. Elias moved through the herd, touching necks, murmuring to each horse, letting them know he was there, he was steady, he would lead them to safety. It took 30 minutes to gather them into a loose group near the edge of the meadow. The foals pressed close to their mothers. The yearlings danced nervously, sensing the adults' tension. And the stallion stood at Elias's shoulder, his presence the anchor that kept the entire group from fragmenting into chaos. "How do you want us positioned?" Morrison asked quietly. "Behind and to the sides. Not pushing, just there. If any horse breaks away, move to cut them off, but gently. No shouting, no sudden movements. We're not driving cattle. We're moving family." The riders spread out as instructed. Sarah took the left flank, Morrison the right. Mayor Grady and the two miners formed a loose line behind. Margaret stayed back. She'd already done her part, and she knew her riding skills weren't good enough for what came next. Elias looked at the sun, now past its zenith, and beginning the long slide toward evening. They had maybe 5 hours of good light. 6 miles with a herd, moving at its own pace, it would be close. He thought about the young colt with the white star, about the old grey mare with cougar scars, about the stallion who'd chosen to trust him. Everything he'd failed to do 20 years ago, everyone he'd failed to save, came down to this moment. He took a breath, steadied himself, and began to walk toward the northeast, toward the Blackwood Ranch, toward the only sanctuary these horses might ever have. The stallion walked beside him, rope slack between them, and behind the stallion, like a miracle or a prayer made flesh, the herd followed. At first, they moved hesitantly, stopping every few yards to look back at the familiar meadow. But the stallion kept walking, and Elias kept walking, and gradually the herd's momentum built. They strung out in a ragged line, mares in front with their foals, yearlings in the middle, the old grey mare bringing up the rear like a sergeant watching her troops. The first mile went smoothly. Open grassland, good footing, no obstacles. The horses settled into an easy rhythm, and Elias began to believe it might actually work. Then they reached the place where the trail narrowed between 2 stands of rocks, and the young colt with the white star balked, frightened by the shadows and the confined space. The mother mare stopped, nickering anxiously. The colt planted its feet and refused to move. Behind them the herd piled up, mares bumping into each other, confusion rippling through the group. The stallion's head came up sharply, ears pinned back. This was the moment when everything could fall apart. Elias handed the rope to Sarah and walked back to where the colt stood trembling. He knelt down his knees, protesting the movement, and extended his hand slowly. The colt's nostrils flared. It took a half step back, pressing against its mother's side. Elias stayed still, hand outstretched, and began to hum. The same melody he'd sung when the horses stampeded through town. The old song that carried in its notes the memory of a time when horses and humans moved through the world as partners rather than adversaries. The colt's ears swiveled forward. It took one tentative step toward Elias, then another. When it was close enough, Elias gently touched its soft muzzle. The colt didn't pull away. Elias stood slowly, maintaining contact, and began to walk toward the narrow passage. The colt followed. The mother mare followed, and behind them the rest of the herd resumed their journey, the crisis averted by nothing more than patience and an old man's refusal to let fear win. They moved on, the sun sinking lower, shadows growing longer across the grassland. 4 miles, 5. The Blackwood Ranch coming into view on the horizon, a weathered barn, a house with a sagging porch, fences that had gone to seed. But beyond it, green meadows stretching toward the foothills, a creek glinting silver in the fading light. Almost there, almost safe, but the hardest part was still to come. They were half a mile from the Blackwood property when Caleb Drake appeared. He came from the direction of the ranch, riding a strong roan horse, and he wasn't alone. 2 men flanked him, rough-looking types, with rifles across their saddles, and the hard eyes of men who'd done unpleasant work for money before. Drake pulled up directly in their path, forcing Elias to stop. The herd halted behind him, nervous energy rippling through their ranks. The stallion's ears flattened against his skull, and he moved slightly forward, placing himself between Elias and the threat. "That's far enough," Drake called out. His professional demeanor had evaporated, replaced by cold anger. "I know what you're trying to do, Crane. That telegraph from Helena, very clever. But executive orders can be challenged. And until the territorial courts review it, those horses are still under my jurisdiction." "The order is legal and binding," Mayor Grady said, riding up beside Elias. "You have no authority here. I have these two gentlemen who say otherwise." Drake gestured to his companions. "Mr. Hutchins was very disappointed to learn about your little maneuver. He's authorized me to take whatever steps are necessary to protect his investment." "By killing horses?" Sarah's voice was sharp with contempt. "By managing a wildlife population that threatens commercial interests. Perfectly legal, perfectly justified." Drake's hand moved toward his rifle. "Now, I'm giving you one chance to turn this herd around and take them back to that meadow. Come sundown, we'll conduct the reduction operation as planned. Or," he paused, "you can resist and we'll be forced to take action right here." The two hired men shifted in their saddles, hands moving toward their weapons. Morrison's hand went to his pistol, but he was one deputy against 3 armed men, and the math wasn't good. Elias felt the moment crystallizing around him. 20 years ago, he'd faced men like this with guns and righteous anger and absolute certainty, and he'd lost everything. Now he was older, he was outnumbered, and the stakes were just as high. But something had changed. He wasn't alone this time, and he wasn't the same man. "You're going to shoot me?" Elias asked quietly. "In front of witnesses? In front of a deputy sheriff and the mayor of Dusty Creek? If you force me to." "And then what? You kill all these horses, file a report saying they attacked you?" Elias shook his head slowly. "That might have worked if you'd moved fast, Drake. But Margaret Hayes has already sent a full report to Helena about your arrangement with Hutchins, about the fraud. The Territorial Attorney General has that information now. You pull that trigger, you're not just killing horses, you're ending your career and probably heading to prison." Drake's face went pale, then red. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Elias took a step forward, and the stallion moved with him, a wall of muscle and barely contained power. "Here's what I think, Drake. I think you're desperate. I think Hutchins promised you more money than you've ever seen, and you thought this would be easy. Just another assessment, just another report, and you'd walk away rich. But it's not easy anymore. Now you have to choose, ride away, and hope you can salvage something from this mess, or commit murder in front of half a dozen witnesses and guarantee you'll hang for it." The two hired men were looking at Drake uncertainly now, the equations changing in their heads. Whatever Hutchins was paying them, it probably wasn't worth a murder charge. "You have no right," Drake said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Those horses are under territorial protection, are standing on land designated as a wildlife preserve, and are surrounded by people who'll testify to every word you've said here today." Mayor Grady's voice was hard as iron. "Now, unless you want me to ride back to town and bring Sheriff Brennan out here with a warrant for your arrest on charges of attempted fraud and making terroristic threats, I suggest you turn that horse around and ride back to wherever you came from." One of the hired men turned his horse without waiting for Drake's response. "I'm not getting hanged over some horses," he muttered, and rode away. The second man hesitated, looked at Drake, then followed his companion. Drake sat alone on his roan, his face working with rage and humiliation. For a moment, Elias thought the man might actually draw his rifle, might force this to its worst possible conclusion. But Drake was a bureaucrat, not a gunfighter. He was good at paperwork and justifications and standing behind the law. When the law abandoned him, he had nothing left. "This isn't over," Drake said. "Hutchins has lawyers. He'll fight this." "Let him fight," Elias replied. "Courts take time. By the time they rule, these horses will be so settled on their land, so well documented and protected, that moving them will be impossible. And you'll be explaining to a judge why you tried to commit fraud on behalf of a failed land speculator. Drake yanked his horse's head around viciously and spurred it into a gallop, disappearing across the grassland in a cloud of dust and wounded pride. The moment he was gone, Elias felt his legs go weak. He would have fallen if the stallion hadn't been there, solid and real, pressing against him. Sarah was off her horse in an instant, steadying him. "It's done," she said. "It's over." But Elias shook his head. "Not yet. Not until they're safe. Not until they're home." The sun was touching the western peaks when they reached the boundary of the Blackwood Ranch. The old fence had long since fallen into disrepair, but Elias could see where the property lines ran, marked by changes in the grass, by the way the land sloped toward the creek that formed the eastern border. 40 acres. Not much by Montana standards. But for 53 horses, it was enough. It was home. Elias didn't stop at the fence line. He kept walking, the stallion beside him, the herd flowing behind like a river finding its course. They moved across the grassland, past the abandoned barn with its weathered boards and sagging roof, past the house where no one had lived for 5 years. The horses' hooves made a sound like distant thunder, but softer now, purposeful rather than panicked. The creek was their destination, clear water running over smooth stones, lined with willows that provided shade in summer and windbreak in winter. When the stallion saw it, his pace quickened. He pulled ahead of Elias, eager now, and when he reached the water's edge, he lowered his great head and drank deeply. The rest of the herd surged forward, mothers and foals, yearlings and the old grey mare, all of them desperate for water after the long journey. Elias stood back and watched them drink, watched them begin to explore this new territory, watched the tension drain from their bodies as they realized the running was over. The young colt with the white star splashed in the shallows, kicking up spray that caught the late sunlight like diamonds. His mother stood nearby, her head high, watching him play with the eternal patience of mothers everywhere. Sarah dismounted and came to stand beside Elias. "You did it." "We did it," he corrected. "All of us." Morrison joined them, his face showing an emotion Elias had never seen there before. Something like wonder, mixed with the kind of satisfaction that comes from being part of something larger than yourself. "I've been a lawman for 10 years, Morrison said quietly. "Kept order, enforced rules, did everything by the book. But I've never felt like I actually protected anything until today." Mayor Grady arrived last, his horse sweating from the journey, but the old man still sitting tall in the saddle. "Well," he said, surveying the scene, "I suppose Dusty Creek just became the first town in Montana Territory with its own protected wild horse preserve. That ought to be worth something." "Worth everything," Elias said. He walked down to the creek bank and knelt, cupping water in his hands and splashing it on his face. The cold shock of it reminded him he was alive, that this moment was real, that they'd actually succeeded where he'd failed before. The stallion approached him, moving with the calm confidence of a horse who'd found his place. He lowered his head until his nose was inches from Elias's face, and Elias placed both hands on either side of the great horse's head, looking directly into those dark, intelligent eyes. "Thank you," Elias whispered, "for trusting me, for believing we could make it." The stallion exhaled, warm breath against Elias's face, then turned and walked back to the herd. Elias watched him go, watched him position himself on a small rise overlooking the creek, watched him take up the stance of a guardian surveying his domain. The mares grazed peacefully, the foals played in the shallows, and the old grey mare lay down in a patch of soft grass, her work done, her family safe. Margaret Hayes arrived as the sun was setting, riding carefully but with more confidence than she'd shown earlier. She dismounted and pulled papers from her satchel. "These are the official documents from Helena. Governor Whitcomb's signature, the territorial seal, everything legal and binding. The Blackwood property is now the Wild Horse Preserve of Dusty Creek, Montana Territory. protected by executive order and pending permanent designation by the territorial legislature. She handed the papers to Elias, but he passed them immediately to Mayor Grady. "You hold on to these. You're the official authority here. I'm just—" He paused, searching for the right word. "I'm just the caretaker." "Caretaker," Grady repeated, smiling. "That's one word for it. Horse King is another." "I was never a king," Elias said. "Kings rule. I just tried to listen." They stayed until full darkness fell, building a fire near the abandoned house, sharing what food they had, watching the horses settle in for their first night on protected land. The foals lay down first, exhausted from the journey. The mares arranged themselves in a protective circle, and the stallion stood watch on his rise, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, a monument to everything wild and free that refused to be broken. Elias sat with his back against a tree, Sarah on one side and Morrison on the other, and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Not happiness exactly, too much had been lost for simple happiness, but something close to it. Peace, maybe. The knowledge that he'd finally done something right, that he'd finally saved something that mattered. "What happens now?" Sarah asked softly. Elias looked at the herd, at the stallion standing sentinel, at the creek flowing silver in the moonlight. "Now they live. They raise their foals. They run these grasslands. They remember what it means to be free." He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "And I make sure nobody forgets they're here. Nobody forgets what they represent. Nobody takes this from them again." "And what about you?" Morrison asked. "Still going to sweep the saloon porch?" "Probably," Elias said. "A man needs work. But maybe I'll spend my mornings out here first, just to check on them, make sure they're all right." "Every morning?" Sarah teased gently. "Every morning," Elias confirmed, "for as long as I have mornings left." 3 months passed, and winter came to Montana Territory with its usual harsh beauty. Snow covered the grasslands in white, and the creek froze at its edges, leaving only a narrow channel of running water in the center. But the horses adapted, as horses always did. They grew thick winter coats, found shelter in the timber along the northern edge of the preserve, and moved with the instinctive knowledge of creatures who'd survived countless winters before this one. Elias was there every morning, just as he'd promised. He'd repaired part of the barn and kept it stocked with hay for the hardest days, though the horses rarely needed it. They knew how to paw through snow to reach the dried grass beneath, knew how to find the sheltered spots where the wind didn't cut so deep. But Elias came anyway, checking on each horse, counting heads, making sure the young colt with the white star was growing strong, and the old grey mare was holding her weight through the cold months. He still swept the saloon porch in the afternoons, still did odd jobs around town. But something fundamental had changed in how people saw him. He wasn't invisible anymore. Children waved when he passed. Women nodded respectfully. Men stopped to ask him questions about the horses, about the preserve, about the old ways he represented. The story of what happened had spread beyond Dusty Creek. Newspapers in Helena and Butte ran articles about the wild horse preserve, about the old horse king who'd come out of retirement to save a herd from destruction. People started making trips to see the horses, standing at respectful distances, watching the herd graze and play and live free. Tourism brought money to the town. Visitors needed places to stay, meals to eat, supplies to purchase. Mayor Grady had been right. The preserve was worth something after all. Caleb Drake had disappeared, his reputation destroyed by Margaret Hayes's report. Vernon Hutchins had filed legal challenges to the preserve's designation, but each one had been dismissed. The territorial legislature, facing public pressure from citizens who'd read the newspaper stories and heard the tale of the legendary Horse King, had voted to make the preserve's protected status permanent. 40 acres had become 50, then 60, as adjacent property owners donated land or sold it cheap to expand the sanctuary. On a cold December morning, Elias stood by the creek, now frozen solid except for that narrow central channel, and watched the stallion lead the herd to water. The big horse had grown even more magnificent over the months, his coat thick and lustrous, his bearing that of a king who knew his kingdom was secure. He saw Elias and walked over, as he did most mornings now, accepting the man's touch with the calm assurance of old friends. "Your family's safe," Elias told him quietly, his breath misting in the frozen air. "Nobody's going to take this from you, not while I'm alive to prevent it, and when I'm gone, there'll be others. Sarah, Morrison, the mayor, they understand now. They see what you are, what you represent." The stallion huffed, warm breath steaming, then turned back to his herd. Elias watched him go, feeling the weight of years, but also something lighter. The burden of old failures finally set down, replaced by this one small victory that somehow felt like redemption. A sound behind him made him turn. Sarah had come out to the preserve, wrapped in a heavy coat, her breath misting like his. She'd started accompanying him some mornings, saying the walk was good for her, though Elias suspected she came more to keep him company than for exercise. "Cold today," she said, coming to stand beside him. "Gets colder every year, seems like. Or we just feel it more," she smiled. "Margaret sent a letter. She's taken a position with a wildlife protection organization in Washington. Says she's going to make sure what happened here becomes a model for other preserves across the territory. Good for her. She mentioned you in her letter, said to tell you that what you did here, it matters beyond just these 50-some horses. It's changing how people think about wild things, about preservation, about the responsibility we have to protect what's left of the old world." Elias was quiet for a moment, watching a young filly chase her brother across the snow, their hooves kicking up white powder that sparkled in the winter sun. "I don't know about all that. I just know these horses deserved a chance, deserved to live without fear of men with guns and justifications. You gave them that chance, you gave them more than that, you gave them a future." Sarah touched his arm lightly. "And you gave yourself one too. You stopped being the man who lost everything and became the man who saved what mattered." Elias thought about that as they walked back toward town together, their boots crunching in the snow. The man who saved what mattered. It was a better epitaph than he'd expected to earn, better than he probably deserved, but he'd take it. He'd carry it through whatever years remained, and he'd keep showing up every morning to watch the horses run free, to count their heads, to make sure the promise he'd made to them and to himself was kept. That evening, as he sat in his room above the stable, he pulled out the leather cord with its turquoise stone and held it in his scarred palm. It had belonged to his mother, had been her father's before that, had passed down through generations as a symbol of connection to the old ways, the old knowledge. He'd worn it hidden for 20 years, ashamed of what it represented, of his failure to live up to its meaning. Now he wore it outside his shirt where everyone could see. Let them ask questions, let them wonder, let them remember that once, and maybe still, there were people who spoke with horses, who understood that wildness wasn't something to be tamed, but something to be honored. The world was changing, would keep changing, probably faster than any of them could imagine. But here, on 60 acres of protected grassland outside a small Montana town, 53 horses ran free because one old man had refused to let history repeat itself. And that, Elias thought as he lay down to sleep, listening to the winter wind whistle through the stable below, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.